Imagine watching an arrogant CEO trying to humiliate a waitress during an international conference in Dubai, and suddenly being stunned by a response powerful enough to silence the entire hall. Stay with me until the end to discover what she said that was so impactful and profound. And make sure to subscribe now so you don't miss any of our heart-touching stories. The Dubai International Convention Center was a monument to modern grandeur, an architectural space seemingly designed to impress even the most powerful leaders on the planet. Its glass walls reflected the dazzling immensity of the city, while imposing columns clad in gleaming white marble gave the main hall an almost celestial air. Flags from dozens of countries decorated the entrance, swaying gently in the strong air conditioning that kept the atmosphere at a perfect temperature. A red carpet stretched from the main door to the central stage, evoking the feeling of standing in a true temple of global power and wealth. Every detail had been designed to dazzle. Golden chandeliers, carefully positioned lighting, tall tables adorned with rare orchid arrangements, and digital panels displaying the logos of sponsoring corporations. In that hall, sophistication was not merely an adornment. It was a silent weapon reinforcing the grandeur of those who occupied the space. Amid the coming and going of guests, politicians, and international tycoons, a battalion of waiters and waitresses moved through the hall, balancing silver trays loaded with crystal glasses and fine hors d'oeuvres. Among them was Elena Richter, a 40-year-old woman in a spotless black and white uniform, her hair tied neatly in a discreet bun, her posture a mixture of humility and firmness. Her work demanded constant attention. Every gesture had to be precise, every movement executed without the slightest noise, so as not to disturb the heated negotiations swirling around her. Elena had served at important events before, but this one felt different. The weight of the gazes, the concentration of power, the sheer magnitude of the setting, all of it demanded even greater focus and discipline. Yet her eyes reflected determination. She was not merely a waitress in that hall. She was a woman carrying experiences, memories, and a silent strength that no one there could imagine. One that was about to reveal itself at the right moment. The hall pulsed like a living organism. On one side, German investors argued loudly over figures, gesturing energetically while simultaneous interpreters struggled to keep pace with their rapid words. On the other, Arab businessmen exchanged warm greetings, adjusting flawless turbans and offering calculated smiles that masked grueling negotiations. European politicians drifted between groups, throwing out diplomatic phrases and reinforcing strategic alliances. In the background, a tuxedoed pianist played a gentle melody, filling the spaces between conversations and champagne toasts. The air was thick with expensive perfumes, mingled with the refined scent of spices wafting from the international kitchen. Everything exuded perfection, but also a latent tension, as if everyone were engaged in an invisible contest for status and influence. It was in this brilliant, luxurious, and suffocating environment that Elena, seemingly just another worker among giants, walked unknowingly toward becoming the center of the world's attention. Amid all that luxury and diplomacy, one man stood out above the rest. His name was Richard Steinberg, CEO of Steinberg International Holdings, one of the largest investment corporations in the world, headquartered in New York with branches in more than 20 countries. Tall, imposing, with carefully slicked back gray hair and a tailored Italian suit, Richard walked as if the world revolved around his steps. His deep, self-assured voice echoed through the hall as he spoke with investors, as though he were always on stage before an audience. Everyone knew he was influential, and that a glance of approval from him could open doors or close them forever. Yet this influence was paired with an inflated ego and a streak of arrogance that had embarrassed many in the past. For Richard, power wasn't only about negotiating billion-dollar deals. It was about constantly reminding others that he was superior. Two assistants remained close by, carrying tablets and documents, ready to jot down every remark or order from their boss. They followed his movements with near-military precision, aware that even the slightest mistake could trigger an outburst of impatience. Richard was known not only for his strategic intelligence, but also for his fierce intolerance of others' mistakes. His philosophy was simple and cruel. Those not on my level should remain silent. As he strode through the hall, he greeted German investors with rehearsed lines, even attempting a few words in their language to appear more sophisticated. His sycophants applauded these attempts, even when they rang hollow. This constant need to prove cultural and financial superiority made him unbearable to those who knew him well, but no one dared oppose him. The weight of his empire was too great, and many preferred to laugh at his arrogant jokes rather than risk losing profitable deals. Richard left no detail unnoticed. His broad, calculated gestures seemed designed to draw attention. When he raised a champagne glass, he made sure to boast loudly about its rare vintage. When discussing contracts, he rattled off staggering numbers, even in casual conversations, just to remind everyone of his status. Even his platinum Swiss watch, edged with discreet diamonds, seemed more a declaration of wealth than a simple accessory. Yet behind this performance lay an unspoken truth. Richard constantly needed to humiliate someone to reaffirm his power. It was as if his confidence depended on diminishing others, turning them into examples of what he deemed mediocrity. And on that night in Dubai, amid a hall filled with global influencers, his arrogant gaze soon landed on a figure he considered too insignificant to matter. The waitress carrying a tray of champagne glasses quietly among the world's elite. Elena Richter was 40 years old, and her eyes carried a mixture of serenity and resilience that only those who had endured many hardships in life could display. Born in a small village in rural Romania, she grew up facing financial struggles and long days of work alongside her mother, who sewed tirelessly to support the family after Elena's father died prematurely. From an early age, Elena learned that dignity did not depend on wealth but on the choices one made. Even so, life had forced her down difficult paths. She migrated to different countries, learned basic languages to survive temporary jobs, and faced prejudice more than once. Her job in Dubai was more than a means of survival. It was proof to herself that even amid unattainable luxury, she could remain steady, honest, and professional. Every tray she carried also bore the weight of her history, her struggle, and the silent strength that defined her. While the tycoons around her spoke of millions and exotic destinations, Elena focused on the simple, balancing her tray, maintaining a polite smile, holding her posture upright, a respect that never slipped into submission. To many, she was just another worker, a background figure in the event, nearly invisible amid the glitter of lights and the murmur of conversation. But inside, Elena knew that every detail of her work mattered. She noticed everything. The exaggerated gestures, the haughty looks, the way some treated staff as if they didn't exist. She had been the target of contempt before, and each experience was etched in her memory, not as a wound, but as fuel to keep her head held high. What set her apart was that she never allowed scorn to define who she was. Within her, she carried a hidden strength no one there suspected, a strength about to be tested that very night. Elena also possessed a rare gift, born from her childhood in a multicultural village where tourists from all over Europe came to buy local crafts. A sharp ear for languages. Since childhood, she had memorized words, phrases, intonations, and throughout her life developed a surprising command of several tongues. She spoke English, French, Italian, and had advanced knowledge of German, learned from worn-out books and from generous tourists who had taught her expressions during their visits. Though she had never attended a prestigious university, her curiosity and discipline had made her a determined autodidact. This talent, hidden beneath a simple uniform and an exhausting waitress routine, would be the very thing to change the course of that night in Dubai. But until then, No one in that hall could have imagined that the woman with silent steps and a steady tray would turn the entire room upside down with just a few words spoken at the right moment. Richard Steinberg adjusted the cuff of his Italian silk shirt and took a few steps toward the group of German investors conversing animatedly near the stage. He had an almost theatrical instinct for spotting opportunities to showcase himself, and his mind calculated every move as if he were in a carefully rehearsed play. As he spoke of billion-dollar contracts and rolled European city names off his tongue like trophies, his eyes scanned the hall for something he could turn into a spectacle. That was when he noticed Elena passing nearby with her tray full of champagne glasses. The contrast between the crystal's sparkle and her simple uniform awakened in Richard the urge to exploit the moment. With a sneer, he raised his chin slightly and, with a crooked smile, decided it would be amusing to ridicule the waitress in front of the foreign investors, as if belittling her could somehow reinforce his own superiority. Focused on balancing her tray, Elena barely noticed his gaze fixating on her movements. The German investors watched her neutrally, without judgment, simply accustomed to the presence of waitstaff at luxury events. But Richard saw in that moment an opportunity to turn normality into a cruel spectacle. In a voice louder than necessary, and with theatrical flair, he commented in English to those around him, "Do you think she understands anything we're saying here? Or does she only know how to carry glasses?" The phrase echoed like a provocation disguised as a joke, and a few nervous laughs followed, born more of embarrassment than amusement. Richard sensed the hesitation and, unwilling to lose his scene, pushed further. He turned toward the German investors and attempted a few words in their language, exaggerating guttural sounds in a mocking imitation, as though about to include Elena in his performance. The mocking smirk on his face made it clear this was not innocent humor, but a calculated attack meant to belittle someone in public. Elena felt the pressure of the moment as glances subtly shifted toward her. Though she hadn't immediately understood the caricatured imitation, Richard's tone made it obvious it was an insult. Inside her, a painful memory resurfaced. The days when she had been mocked in school for her accent when speaking English. The weight of humiliation pressed into her chest like an old scar being reopened. Yet instead of shrinking, she kept her expression serene, as though nothing had happened. Still, her heart pounded, and her thoughts began to organize with remarkable speed. She realized this was the moment when Richard would expose his true nature before everyone. The Germans contained silence, the nervous laughter of sycophants, and the discreet glances of other guests created a charged atmosphere. The hall was no longer just a stage for business. It had become an arena where the first blow had already been struck, and everyone was now waiting, consciously or not, for the reaction of the woman carrying a simple tray of glasses. Richard noticed that his first attempt had produced only timid laughter and uncomfortable glances, but that didn't stop him. On the contrary, it drove him to intensify the spectacle, as if desperately craving applause. He stepped closer to the group of German investors and, raising his voice, began reproducing guttural sounds in an exaggerated way, mocking the German language. "We gets? Blah, blah, blah," he said, bursting into laughter as though he had delivered the cleverest joke of the night. Some guests exchanged uneasy looks, unsure how to respond, while others chose to avert their eyes, pretending not to notice. Richard, however, believed he was shining. To him, turning a waitress into the butt of ridicule was proof of his social dominance. His theatrical gestures drew even more attention. Raising his arms, mimicking accents, laughing loudly, ensuring the entire hall was forced to notice his joke. Elena, standing only a few meters away, held her body firm, gripping the tray as if it were part of her very structure. But inside, every offensive word fell like a heavy stone onto her memory. She understood perfectly what Richard was trying to imitate, and her rudimentary German was enough to catch the sarcasm in every distorted sound. Shame burned in her chest, but it wasn't only shame, it was indignation. Her mind raced, recalling every night spent studying alone, every effort to teach herself languages, every moment when she had been dismissed. Now, before that audience, Richard wasn't mocking just her. He was mocking her story, her effort, everything she had fought for. The urge to respond was growing, but with it came the awareness that she needed to choose her moment carefully. She knew she couldn't answer recklessly. Her response had to be sharp, powerful, final. Meanwhile, the atmosphere of the hall was shifting. The piano, once filling the space with soft melodies, seemed to fade under Richard's boisterous laughter. The German investors, though polite, were clearly uncomfortable, trading discreet looks of disapproval. One even cleared his throat, as if wishing to end the tasteless act, but restrained himself out of respect for business ties. Guests from other countries, curious, turned to watch, and soon Richard's mockery became the center of attention. A wave of discomfort spread silently through the crowd. It was clear to many that the CEO had crossed the line between humor and humiliation. Yet blinded by vanity, he didn't notice. He kept laughing alone, convinced he was in control. And at that exact moment, as everyone watched in silence, the atmosphere began tilting dangerously toward the inevitable confrontation. Richard's loud laughter echoed through the International Convention Center like a discordant note against the pianist's gentle melody. The sound cut through the room harshly, clashing with the sophisticated tone of the conference and exposing his arrogance almost painfully. The German investors, who should have been his allies that night, exchanged quick, uneasy glances. One adjusted his glasses to hide his discomfort, while another fidgeted nervously with his tie, avoiding direct eye contact with the CEO. Their strained smiles betrayed the truth. No one found it funny, but no one dared intervene. It was as if the entire hall had been caught under a cruel spell, where one man's power forced collective silence. Gradually, side conversations quieted, and even the most distracted began to notice something was off. The once lively, buzzing space now felt like a stage, with Richard at the center of a scene far too uncomfortable to ignore. As Richard laughed, believing his performance impressive, other guests reacted discreetly. A woman in a navy blue gown, elegantly seated near the aisle, shook her head in disapproval, whispering something in English to her husband. A young receptionist standing behind the information desk bit his lip to hold back indignation, knowing he couldn't get involved. Even a waiter carrying a tray of wine glasses faltered, spilling a few drops upon realizing the offensive nature of the scene. It was as though every person in the room carried the same dilemma within: remain silent to preserve order, or react to injustice. The collective discomfort hung heavy in the air, but most chose passivity. Still, the eyes said everything. Every look cast at Richard was a silent accusation, and every glance at Elena was an unspoken invitation to resist. Little by little, the hall turned into a cauldron of expectation. The golden lights of the chandeliers reflected off glasses and mirrors, amplifying the tension in the air. The waiter's steps seemed slower, guests' gestures more restrained, as if everyone wished to watch without drawing attention. In the corner, the pianist unconsciously softened his playing, sensing the strange energy that had overtaken the room. Even the simultaneous translators, trained to block out distractions, faltered for a few seconds, losing track of their translation as they watched. It was clear something greater was about to happen. The silence was not mere absence of sound. It was a collective held breath flowing through every corner of the hall. Everyone knew the humiliation had reached its breaking point, and the next move would be decisive. The air itself felt electrified, ready to explode at any moment, depending solely on the reaction of the woman who, until now, had remained silent. Elena felt every gaze fall upon her like invisible spotlights illuminating her presence. Outwardly, She remained still, balancing the tray with near unshakable steadiness. But inside a storm of emotions raged restlessly. The loneliness of standing exposed before hundreds of strangers mingled with wounded pride, reviving old memories that still burned like scars. She remembered the days she had been mocked by classmates when trying to pronounce English words, burdened by the accent of her homeland. She remembered the tears shed behind closed doors, the moments she had nearly given up on learning. But that night in Dubai, something was different. Instead of shrinking under humiliation, she felt within herself a force she had never known. It was as though every insult Richard threw became fuel, feeding a fire that would eventually break free. Her heart beat in sync with the grand golden clock adorning the hall, each tick a reminder that the time for submission was running out. With every passing second, the flame inside her grew stronger. First anger, then indignation, and finally dignity. Elena didn't just want to respond to Richard. She wanted to show everyone that no one has the right to diminish another human being. Her fingers trembled briefly on the tray's handle, but soon steadied with the rigidity of a soldier standing at attention. The humble waitress, long reduced to a background figure in luxurious halls, was beginning to emerge as the protagonist of her own story. Still silent, her body already radiated the energy of someone ready to break the invisible chains that bound her. While Richard kept laughing, unaware that his act no longer drew applause, Elena took a deep breath, letting the hall's cold air fill her lungs. The fragrance of expensive perfumes mingled with a memory from her childhood, the scent of fabric scraps as she helped her mother sew clothes in a tiny improvised workshop. That memory brought clarity. She had faced far worse than offensive words to reach this point. She had survived poverty, prejudice, and loneliness. And now, standing before an international audience, she would not be brought down by arrogant laughter. Her eyes, until then lowered, began to rise slowly, revealing a new, intense light that could not be ignored. The guests closest to her noticed first, exchanging surprised glances. Something was about to happen. Elena, who moments ago seemed just another figure in the background, was ready to turn pain into courage, and in doing so, change the course of that night. Richard, completely intoxicated by his own vanity, failed to notice that his audience was no longer with him. He believed he still commanded the room, when in reality every word he spoke was like a stone thrown into the growing silence. With a mocking grin, he raised his voice even higher, exaggerating his theatrical gestures. Turning to the German investors, he attempted to string together phrases he thought were funny, but the result was nothing but disrespectful caricature. Ja, wunderbar, Kartoffel, blah blah blah, he exclaimed, laughing loudly as if he were the greatest comedian of the night. His guttural, disjointed sounds rang out ridiculously under the golden chandeliers, drawing only looks of discomfort. To Richard, however, it was a performance, and he was the star. He lifted his champagne glass as if it were a microphone, mimicking the robotic tone of a foreigner, trying to force laughter from those around him. In his mind, each second was proof of his power, evidence that even in trivialities he deserved applause. But the hall reacted differently than the illusion he built in his head. The easy laughter was gone, replaced by stiff expressions and heavy stares. A refined lady seated at one of the tables shook her head in disapproval and murmured in French, "Seihan too. This is shameful." A young American entrepreneur discreetly raised his phone behind his wine glass and began recording, realizing he was witnessing a scene destined to spread far beyond the hall. The German investors, who should have felt honored by Richard's attention, instead exchanged looks of disapproval, frowning and leaning back in their chairs. Even the pianist in the corner hesitated for a brief moment, his hands hovering above the keys as if he too felt the break in atmosphere. Discomfort spread like invisible fire through the room, racing across tables and corridors. Every guest silently wondered how far the CEO would go, and with each passing second, the weight of tension grew heavier. Elena observed everything in silence, but it was not passive silence. It was silence charged with restrained energy. Her eyes followed Richard's every gesture, every distorted sound that left his mouth, every false smile he offered to his flatterers. Her heart beat fast, but her breathing remained steady, like someone who knew the right moment was drawing near. She felt the invisible rope sustaining this spectacle of humiliation being pulled to its limit, ready to snap. And for the first time, she lifted her gaze directly to the man mocking her. Elena's eyes were intense, steady, almost cutting, and those closest noticed the change immediately. Her shoulders straightened, her chin rose subtly, and her posture shifted. It was like watching the prelude to a storm. Everyone knew something powerful was about to happen, though no one dared predict how. The feeling in the air was that humiliation was about to be answered with a force no one would ever forget. The entire hall seemed suspended in a collective trance as Richard's loud laughter finally began to fade. What had once been a vibrant murmur of negotiations and toasts had turned into a heavy emptiness, where even the sound of glasses against marble felt intrusive. The silence was not natural. It was dense, suffocating, as if every person had simultaneously decided to fall quiet to see how far this would go. The golden chandeliers reflected in hundreds of attentive eyes, and the tension hovered like a storm cloud ready to burst. Even the pianist, who had tried to maintain his discreet melody, stopped for a moment, letting the absence of notes amplify the discomfort. Every gaze was divided between Richard, still smiling with misplaced confidence, and Elena, motionless yet radiating something few could define. It was as if the entire hall had collectively held its breath, waiting for the next move. Elena drew in a deep breath, letting the cold, faintly perfumed air of the hall fill her lungs like fuel for the courage about to surface. Her shoulders, once slightly bent under the weight of work and discretion, now straightened with firmness. The tray in her hands ceased to be just a tool. It became almost a symbol of resistance. Slowly, her eyes, which had remained lowered, began to rise. First with caution, then with certainty, until they locked directly onto Richard. The glow in her gaze revealed something new. No fear, no submission, only determination. A nearby guest noticed the shift and discreetly widened his eyes, as if sensing the story's turning point. It was a silent transformation, yet powerful, and with every second the anticipation grew heavier. Richard, lost in his own performance, did not notice the change at first. He continued gesturing wildly, convinced he still commanded everyone's attention. But while he laughed alone, the audience was transfixed by Elena. Her movements, however subtle, carried a magnetic force that held every gaze. A waiter froze in the middle of the aisle, tray in hand, as if he had forgotten his next step. A receptionist stopped writing mid-note and lifted her eyes to watch. Even the German investors, who had endured being the indirect targets of mockery, now held their breath, awaiting the reaction of the woman Richard believed insignificant. The silence, now unbearable, was like a string stretched to its breaking point. Just one gesture, one word from Elena, would snap it, and everyone, without exception, knew that moment was about to arrive. The tray's handle, moments ago nothing but a tool of her work, had become a symbol of defiance in Elena's hands. Her fingers, once trembling, now gripped the metal firmly, as though all her accumulated courage rested within it. The memory of her father surfaced vividly, his voice echoing from the past to guide her. The tongue is the most powerful weapon a person can carry. Use it wisely. It was advice she had heard countless times in her Romanian childhood. But in that moment, it rang with almost prophetic force. Elena inhaled deeply, letting the hall's cool, perfumed air flood her chest. Every second of silence was a choice, a calculated act of preparation. She was no longer the woman who bowed under haughty stares, but a figure who, without a word, made the entire hall bend toward her. The contrast between her simplicity and the ostentation around her made her presence even more magnetic, as if her dignity had finally found room to bloom. The audience, perhaps without realizing it, had already aligned with her. A waiter nearby stood frozen, his eyes fixed on Elena's upright posture, as though witnessing something beyond a mere social clash. A receptionist, accustomed to serving arrogant executives without emotion, let out a faint sigh of expectation, sensing that something extraordinary was imminent. The German investors, who had endured the grotesque mockery of their language in silence, now exchanged discreet glances, some with eyebrows raised in surprise, others with eyes full of curiosity. The hall, once alive with voices and laughter, had turned into a suspended theater, every detail waiting for resolution. Even the golden chandeliers seemed to shine differently, casting beams of light over Elena as though highlighting her from the crowd. She had not spoken a single word, yet her posture already communicated something the audience instinctively understood. Her silence was not submission, it was preparation. Richard, however, was blind to this transformation. His ego, swollen like a balloon ready to burst, convinced him that Elena would never dare retaliate. He mistook dignity for fear, silence for weakness, calm for defeat. This delusion led him to intensify his provocations. He raised his voice louder now, gestured more grotesquely, and mimicked accents in absurd exaggerations, believing he still entertained his audience. But his act was increasingly out of place. The smiles around him were no longer amused, but strained. They were looks that said, "You've gone too far." While Richard flaunted himself, Elena stared back with growing firmness, her gaze almost hypnotic. Her eyes were like a blade, poised to slice through the mask of arrogance he wore. Time itself seemed to slow, each second stretching into an eternity of expectation. The entire hall held its breath, awaiting the response that, everyone knew, would forever change the course of that night in Dubai. The entire hall seemed frozen in time, as if even the air had stopped circulating, when Elena finally raised her head. Her dark eyes, once serene, now blazed with an intensity no one would have expected to see in a simple waitress. She took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch a moment longer, drawing the tension to its breaking point. Then her voice emerged calm, steady, carrying a confidence that contrasted with the humble posture she had held until now. "Glauben Sie wirklich, das Ihr Wort Michigan Kleiner Machen?" she asked in flawless German, her clear, perfect pronunciation echoing across the luxurious hall. The effect was immediate. Richard's laughter died on his lips, ripped away as if by force, while the German investors widened their eyes, stunned by the reversal. Murmurs rippled among the guests like waves spreading through the golden room, each carrying shock, admiration, and respect. Even the pianist, who had tried to resume his melody, stopped once more, his hands hovering above the keys as though hypnotized by the scene. Richard blinked rapidly, trying to process what he had just heard. His confidence slipped away like sand through his fingers, even as he tried to hide his discomfort behind a forced smile. You speak German?" he asked in English, his voice lower, unsteady, stripped of the authority it carried minutes earlier. But Elena did not look away, nor did she retreat a step. On the contrary, she advanced slightly, closing the distance between them. Her face radiated serenity, yet her posture emanated power. "Ich spreche nicht nur Deutsch," she answered slowly. "Ich have jetzt Beleidigungen verstanden." "I don't just speak German. I understood every insult you threw at me." The phrase sliced through the air like a blade, and the audience's reaction was explosive. A collective murmur rising like a wave ready to break into a storm. Even a Japanese tourist, who did not understand the language, turned to watch, drawn by the sheer intensity that now dominated the room. The impact lay not only in the words, but in the way they were spoken. Elena did not raise her voice, did not shout, did not lose control. Her calm was her greatest weapon, and every syllable carried a weight impossible to ignore. It was like watching a play where the background character suddenly stepped into the lead role. Guests leaned forward, captivated by every detail. The German investors, torn between surprise and admiration, could barely disguise the respect they were beginning to feel. A waiter set his tray down on a table and crossed his arms, watching with a faint smile. Even the crystal chandeliers seemed to shine brighter, as though the very room celebrated her courage. For the first time that night, Richard Steinberg had no ready response. The script he always controlled had been torn apart in front of everyone, and the audience knew. The once muted voice had become the most powerful in the hall. Richard blinked quickly, as if trying to reorganize his thoughts in the midst of the shock. The man who, minutes ago, seemed to command the hall with his voice and gestures now stood exposed, disarmed, before an audience that no longer applauded him. He forced a nervous smile, the kind that convinces no one, and replied in a tone lower than usual, almost hesitant. "So, you really do speak German?" His voice, once booming like thunder, now sounded fragile, almost pleading, and that shift did not go unnoticed. The German investors, who had been the direct targets of his grotesque imitation, could not hide their astonishment and discomfort. Their attention, once fixed on Richard, was now firmly with Elena. The heavy silence filling the hall made one thing clear: something irreversible had happened. For the first time, Richard was no longer in control of the script. Elena did not break eye contact for a single second. Every fiber of her body radiated firmness. Every detail of her expression declared she would not back down. A fierce light in her eyes betrayed years of forced silence now transformed into pure strength. She took another step forward, and the sound of her simple shoes against the marble floor echoed like a war drum. The audience reacted instantly. Some guests held their breath. Others exchanged glances as though witnessing a historic moment. Elena lifted her chin with serenity and spoke again, still in German, so the magnitude of the moment would be unmistakable. "I do not just speak your language, Mr. Steinberg. I recognize every insult that came from your mouth." Her tone was deliberate, surgical, like a precise strike. Murmurs surged, spreading across the hall like waves crashing against mirrored walls. Richard's face flushed red, betraying a mix of shame and anger he could no longer conceal. Richard tried to fight back. He forced a dry laugh, adjusted his tie, and raised his voice, as if volume could restore the authority he had lost. "Well, it seems the lady knows a few words," he said in English, attempting to downplay her revelation. But his voice no longer carried weight. It sounded thin, hesitant, stripped of its usual confidence. The German investors exchanged quick glances, and one even shook his head silently, unwilling to indulge him any longer. The audience, watchful, no longer saw a commanding leader but the shadow of a man desperately clinging to a crumbling mask. Every gesture, the nervous tug of his tie, the heavy breaths, the restless hands, betrayed his fragility. The scene no longer belonged to him, and everyone knew it. The spotlight had shifted to the woman who, just minutes earlier, had been dismissed as invisible. Elena remained steady, her composure contrasting almost cruelly with Richard's visible unease. He fiddled with his expensive watch as though seeking an anchor, but nothing could hide the flush spreading across his face. The entire hall watched the stark contrast. On one side, a powerful CEO unraveling under the weight of his own arrogance. On the other, a humble waitress who, with dignity, had become the protagonist. The silence was so deep that even the faintest sounds, the clink of a glass, The scrape of a distant chair rang amplified. Elena took another step forward, her gaze locked on the man who had insulted her, and said in a serene, flawless tone, "These are not just a few words, Mr. Steinberg. They are years of study, effort, and respect for the very languages you used to offend." Her voice cut through the hall like a sentence, impossible to ignore. The impact was immediate and collective. Guests who had remained silent let out sighs of admiration, while others responded with discreet nods, as if confirming the power of her words. A young woman near the reception desk whispered a stunned "wow" in English. A businessman closed his eyes briefly, shaking his head in silent approval. Even staff trained to remain neutral, receptionists, waiters, security guards, exchanged subtle glances of solidarity, recognizing the rare courage unfolding before them. Elena was not merely speaking, she was embodying dignity. Her posture, her serenity, her confidence were a performance far more powerful than any cruel joke could ever be. And each phrase landed as a collective reminder. True greatness is not measured by wealth or status, but by how one chooses to treat others. Richard, meanwhile, seemed to shrink with every word. His shoulders, once lifted in arrogance, now slumped slightly as though crushed by the weight of his own shame. He tried to muster a response, but his mouth opened without forming a coherent sentence. The audience saw clearly. The man who had always controlled the boardroom no longer had command over even himself. Elena, serene, had claimed the stage without raising her voice or breaking her composure. Every fidget of his hands, every nervous throat clearing, every avoided glance only underscored his defeat. And before everyone's eyes, the waitress was no longer just an employee. She had become the embodiment of silent courage transformed into strength. In that moment, there was no doubt. Richard Steinberg was already defeated, even if he refused to admit it. Richard drew a deep breath, desperately trying to regain control of the situation. Sweat gleamed on his forehead under the golden chandeliers, and his restless hands tugged at his jacket again and again, as though the expensive fabric could restore his lost poise. His wounded ego still pushed him to resist the tide that had clearly turned against him. Raising his voice louder than before, he tried to impose authority. "This is ridiculous. No one came to this conference to hear a waitress give moral lessons." The words echoed through the hall but sounded weak, like a distant echo, stripped of the confidence they once carried. The silence that followed was even more devastating. It was as if every person present had understood, in that moment, that the CEO was spent, his words empty, his power gone. Some guests exchanged looks of pure indignation. An elderly lady, elegantly dressed, raised an eyebrow in disapproval and murmured in French to her friend beside her, "Doesn't he realize he's already lost?" A young American executive shook his head, incredulous at the scene unfolding. The very German investors, indirect targets of his mockery, crossed their arms and turned their gaze away from Richard, as though distancing themselves without moving a step. What once had been invisible applause for the tycoon was now a silent tribunal, and every glance cast at him was a verdict of reproach. Even the hotel staff, trained for absolute neutrality, exchanged complicit glances, as if finally witnessing justice take place before their eyes. Richard spoke, but no one truly listened anymore. They only heard the emptiness echoing in each syllable. Elena remained still, yet the serenity on her face said more than any quick reply ever could. The audience understood she did not need to rush, that the sheer contrast between her calm and Richard's agitation was enough to dismantle him. The silence that stretched before her response was like an invisible weapon, pulling the tension to its limit. The CEO, increasingly uneasy, searched the room for support, but found nothing except cold, judging eyes. His imagined allies had vanished, and the crowd he once believed he controlled now belonged to Elena. With every passing second, his image of authority crumbled further, and the entire hall realized the truth. Richard Steinberg, the man who prided himself on humiliating others to prove his power, was reduced to a shadow of himself. Elena drew in a deep breath, allowing the silence to linger a few seconds longer, as if ensuring everyone would etch the moment into memory. Her eyes, locked on Richard, radiated unyielding firmness, yet without hatred. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear, calm, and serene, in sharp contrast to the disguised anger of the man before her. "I am not just a waitress," she said, each word dropping like a stone into the silent lake of the hall. "I am a woman who works with dignity, who has learned more languages than you could ever imagine, and who will never bow to someone who hides their poverty of spirit behind wealth." The words cut through the air like glass, shattering the last remnants of arrogance clinging to Richard. The reaction was immediate. The audience, which had been holding its breath, erupted into a collective murmur that quickly turned into applause. Some clapped discreetly, with solemn respect. Others, more moved, rose to their feet, celebrating the courage of the woman who had dared to say what everyone longed to hear. The receptionist at the desk discreetly wiped away a tear, while the pianist resumed his melody, this time with stronger, almost triumphant notes, as though translating the moment into music. Even the German investors, who had witnessed the scene with wide eyes, nodded silently, recognizing the weight of her response. Richard, meanwhile, seemed to shrink before the crowd. His shoulders hunched, his breath heavy, his gaze lost. There was no reply possible. The entire hall knew Elena had won. Elena, however, did not celebrate theatrically. She did not raise her arms, did not smile arrogantly, did not revel in the applause. Her posture remained serene, her expression firm, radiating only the dignity of someone who knew she had done what was right. She was not seeking personal glory. She sought only to show that no one should be reduced to silence by another's arrogance. Her eyes swept the hall, and every person felt that her words were not only for Richard, but for all who had ever been underestimated, ignored, or diminished. In that instant, Elena was no longer just a hotel employee in Dubai. She had become a symbol of courage and justice. And before everyone, she ended the confrontation with nothing more than her voice and her resolve. The hall of the Dubai International Convention Center erupted in applause, shattering the heavy tension that had hung in the air moments before. It was not timid or restrained clapping, but a unanimous wave that reverberated against the glass and marble walls like a collective thunder. People rose from their seats, some with tears in their eyes, others clapping with uncontained enthusiasm. An elderly woman lifted her glass toward Elena in a silent salute of respect. Hotel staff, once bound to neutrality, allowed themselves discreet smiles and even applause. The pianist, swept up in the moment, let his hands dance across the keys in a vibrant, almost heroic melody that seemed to translate victory into sound. It was as if the entire room had chosen, at once, to recognize and celebrate the dignity of a woman who had dared to face the powerful and defeat him without weapons, only with the strength of truth. Richard, cornered, could no longer react. Every clap was a sentence against him. Every stare at his flushed face and slumped posture reinforced his defeat. The man who had wielded fear and arrogance as tools now stood disarmed before his own audience. He tried to force a smile, but the gesture came out distorted, grotesque, incapable of hiding the failure etched in his eyes. He was no longer the center of the hall, no longer admired or feared. He had become a living example of how pride leads to downfall. The most painful realization for him was knowing the scene would not remain confined to these walls. Cell phones recorded, eyes bore witness, and his image collapsed before the world. In that moment, Richard Steinberg was no longer an influential CEO. He was merely a man undone by his own vanity. Elena, on the other hand, did not seek to savor the victory. She stood tall, carrying the same serenity she always had, now magnified by the unanimous respect surrounding her. Her eyes conveyed neither hatred nor vengeance, only the dignity of someone who had finally been heard. To many present, she was no longer just a hotel employee, but a symbol, a reminder never to underestimate someone based on their position. Guests left the hall whispering in different languages that they would never forget this scene, that it would remain a lesson etched into memory. Elena lowered her eyes slowly, not in submission, but in respect for the moment. She knew she had made history, and unintentionally, had given voice to all those who had ever been diminished in silence. And to you, who stayed with us until the end, let this be your reflection. Never judge someone by appearance or by their role, because true greatness often hides behind humility. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next videos, and of course, leave your like. It helps us continue bringing you more emotional stories like this one. Thank you so much for your support.